When police entered Dagmar Overby's apartment, they found ashes in the stove, a small baby necklace inside the wardrobe, and 20 photographs in a drawer. It took them a moment to understand what they were looking at. Then it took even longer to understand the scale of what had happened there. This is the story of Denmark's most prolific serial killer, a woman who turned the desperation of abandoned mothers into a business and who operated for years in plain sight, without anyone asking the right question at the right time. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, now's a good time. Hit the bell too. There's a new case every week. Copenhagen, August 1920. Caroline Hagensen had folded and unfolded that newspaper clipping so many times the creases had gone white. The paper was soft at the edges, as if it had absorbed days of sweat from her hands being carried in her apron pocket. The ad was simple, a few lines. A woman willing to take in children who needed a home. There was a reference number at the bottom, the kind of classified anyone could find in a Copenhagen evening paper at the time, wedged between rental listings and domestic job offers, so unremarkable that most people turned the page without blinking. But Caroline wasn't most people at that moment. She was a young working woman with a 3-week-old daughter in her arms and a family that simply couldn't know. She went to the apartment in the Vesterbro neighborhood on a weekend morning. She climbed the stairs with the baby wrapped in a wool cloth, and when the door opened, what she found on the other side was reassuring in an almost deliberate way. A woman in her early 30s, dark hair pinned back, clean apron. A small child playing in the corner of the living room with a spool of thread. Framed pictures on the walls, a lace cloth over the sofa, the smell of coffee. The two sat down. They talked. The woman was calm, spoke slowly, had an attention turned entirely toward Caroline, the kind that makes you feel your problem is the most important problem in the room. Or she said she understood the situation. She said there were many mothers like this. Good women in difficult circumstances. She said the baby would be fine. Caroline looked at her daughter one last time. She carefully placed a thin little necklace around her neck, a small gesture, the kind a mother makes when she wants some part of herself to stay with her child. She left the money on the table. She kissed the baby's forehead and left. The door closed behind her with a soft click. What happened on the other side of that door, Caroline wouldn't know for a few days, but the police would know in less than 48 hours. Because when the detectives entered that apartment, the first thing they felt wasn't the smell of coffee. It was another smell. Before talking about what Dagmar Overby did, we need to talk about what happened to her. Not because one thing explains the other. That's not it. But because the world she grew up in will show up again in this story, and when it does, it will be important to recognize it. She was born on April 23rd, 1887, in a small parish in rural Denmark, the youngest child of a family that barely had enough to survive. Her father was a farmhand, the kind who drifts from farm to farm chasing seasonal work, so the family moved with him. One farm here, another there, never long in one place, never roots planted in any ground. She had 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters. The oldest brother died as a child. The family never stopped long enough to properly grieve. Dagmar started school around the age of 8, when the family settled for a time in Aarhus. She studied for 4 years. At 13, she was working at a dairy, helping make ice cream and running deliveries. She was a girl who liked to talk, who had opinions about everything, who didn't take well to adults telling her no. She was also a girl who stole. It was as if the notion of belonging simply didn't apply to her. An ease in taking what she wanted without feeling she was doing anything wrong. The neighbours knew. The employers knew. Everyone knew, and everyone looked sideways. And Dagmar kept going the same way. Over the following years, she drifted through a series of farms, jobs, and boarding houses scattered across the Danish countryside. In 1909, she was caught stealing from a house where she worked and sentenced to 10 days of hard labour. When she got out, she returned to Aarhus, found work at a restaurant, and met a man named Peter Bisgaard. They had a son together. In September 1910, Axel was born. Peter wanted nothing to do with the child. Dagmar kept the boy, moved in with her sister Emilie. She tried. For a time, she genuinely tried. But in November 1911, Axel got sick. The official cause of death on the record was pneumonia. The doctors who examined the small body didn't perform an autopsy. It wasn't standard practice. There was no formal indication of a crime. But they noted in their records that the boy's lips were blue, that his face had a dark, almost violet colouring, the kind of finding that doesn't quite fit with pneumonia. Police spoke with Dagmar. They asked the routine questions. Nothing was proven. The case was closed. She was 24 years old. She had lost her son, been questioned as a suspect in his death, and walked out of the station without charges. She kept moving. One man, then another, then another. A farmer, a woodcutter, a fish merchant she formally married on April 1st, 1912. A marriage that lasted less than 2 months before she walked out the door and moved in with someone else. She had 2 more children outside of marriage in quick succession. One was left in a stable on a nearby farm on a September night in 1913, wrapped in a cloth, alone in the dark. Someone found him hours later, still crying. After that, some sources from the trial mentioned that Dagmar had tried to kill herself, that she had taken ether, a substance that at the time circulated both as an anesthetic and as an intoxicant among people who needed something to dull what they felt, that she had drunk enough to lose consciousness, but not enough to not wake up. The information was never confirmed with precision. What is confirmed is that when she arrived in Copenhagen, Dagmar had a small daughter, no money, and a set of skills that made her very good at one specific thing: appearing trustworthy. In 1915, she managed to open a confectionery shop in the Amager neighborhood. Ice cream, candy, waffles. A young supplier named Sven Sensen delivered the merchandise every day. They started seeing each other beyond the deliveries. She moved into an apartment with him. For a time, it seemed like there was something stable there. A man, a roof, a small but functioning business, her daughter, Irina, growing up. A life that, if not easy, at least had shape. Then the shop closed. Sensen lost his job. Dagmar was hospitalized with severe peritonitis. She spent more than a month in the hospital. When she got out, her daughter had been temporarily sent to an orphanage. They had been evicted, and the 2 of them were sharing a tiny room with another couple who also had nowhere to go. Sensen made it very clear he didn't want children. Dagmar heard that, let it settle, and then walked to a newsstand, bought a copy of the Copenhagen evening paper, and opened it to the classified section. She started reading the adoption ads. The ad Dagmar placed was straightforward. A couple looking for a child to adopt. They could pay a monthly care fee. The first to respond was Rasmin Kirstine Jensen, 26 years old, recently divorced. The baby's father had disappeared, and she simply couldn't support the child alone. The boy's name was Harry. He was 3 weeks old. They met in mid-April 1916. Rasmin brought the baby in a bundle with a small case of clothes and diapers and handed Dagmar 12 crowns, the first monthly payment the father had sent. The deal was simple. Dagmar would receive that amount every month in exchange for caring for Harry. Rasmin left in tears. Dagmar placed Harry in a baby carriage and went out for a walk. What happened on that walk, she described later at trial, with a precision that left the courtroom in silence. She said she pushed the carriage through Copenhagen streets with no particular destination, that at some point she passed the assistance cemetery, one of the oldest in the city, with tall trees and stone benches among the headstones. She said she sat down on a bench, looked at the baby, and that in that moment she realized she couldn't bring him home. That Sensen had made it clear he didn't want a child there, that she had no way to support Harry, that she made a decision. Harry's body was found 3 days later, discarded in a latrine inside the cemetery. A thin cord was wrapped around the baby's neck. Someone had noticed the smell. The body was retrieved. The story ran in the papers. A baby found, unidentified. Yeah, no family had come forward. Rasmin Jensen didn't connect the dots. How could she? She had handed her son to a well-presented woman who lived in a clean apartment, and she had received confirmation by letter. The letter. Dagmar had come home after doing what she did at the cemetery, pushing the empty carriage through Copenhagen streets. She had entered the apartment. She had sat down at the table. She had picked up paper and pen, and she had written to Rasmin that Harry was doing well, that he was calm, that he didn't cry much. Sensen was home when she returned with the empty carriage. He didn't ask anything. Days later, he sold the carriage to a neighbour for 20 crowns. He didn't ask where the empty carriage had come from. He didn't ask any questions. Harry's body was found. The paper published the story. No family came forward. The investigation went nowhere. A few weeks later, Dagmar crossed paths on the street with Maren Hansen, the mother of the second baby, the one who had paid 300 crowns and handed over her daughter. Maren stopped. She looked at the carriage. Inside was another child. Not her daughter, but Maren didn't know that. How is she? She asked. Dagmar tilted the carriage slightly toward her. She's fine, growing. Maren looked at the baby for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," said it made her feel better. Dagmar nodded and kept walking. Rasmin Jensen also showed up a few weeks later. Not on the street. She came to the apartment. She wanted to see her son. Dagmar received her calmly. She led her to the room where the Christensen baby was, another child she had received days before and decided not to kill. He was in the same crib, roughly the same size. "He's doing well," Dagmar said. "He's eating. He's calm." Rasmin leaned over the crib. She touched the baby's hand. She stayed like that for a few minutes, in silence. She left convinced she had just visited her son. 14 days after Harry's death, Dagmar placed another ad in the paper. A young woman named Maren Pauline Hansen had a 1-month-old daughter she couldn't raise. The child had been born out of wedlock in 1916 Denmark. That could destroy a young woman's reputation, cut off her access to employment, housing, any form of support. There was no state safety net. There was no law that effectively obliged the father to contribute. There was only judgment and the merciless arithmetic that a young woman alone could barely support herself. She paid Dagmar 300 Danish crowns, an enormous sum, equivalent to a woman's annual salary. She handed over the baby, waited until the door closed, and left without looking back. Dagmar stayed home with the baby for a time. Then she strangled her. She wrapped the small body in old rags. The next day, she went out with her daughter, Irina, who was about 3.5 years old, for a tram ride. She got off at a specific stop. Irina waited on the sidewalk while her mother disappeared under a bridge with something wrapped in her arms. When she came back, her hands were empty. What happened to Irina that afternoon is one of those things no document can answer. She was too young to have words for it. Maybe she didn't know what her mother was carrying. Maybe she understood better than any adult would like to admit. What the records show is only the external outline. A child on the sidewalk, the mother disappearing, the mother returning. Empty hands. After the second death, Dagmar answered a third ad. Esther Matilda Larsson was 19 years old. The son she had named Paul was the result of a relationship with an older co-worker. The man didn't want the child. Esther couldn't raise him alone either. They arranged things with Dagmar. 200 crowns on delivery, plus 30 crowns a month, for 10 months. Dagmar went to their home to collect Paul. She picked up the baby. She left the apartment. At trial, when asked about Paul, Dagmar said she couldn't remember exactly how she had killed the boy, or how she had disposed of the body. The judges looked at her. She added nothing. What is known is that Paul didn't survive his first day. The outcome was always the same. The method sometimes she simply didn't retain. After the third death, Dagmar and Sensen moved to a different address in Copenhagen. They had more space now. Money was coming in from multiple sources. Monthly payments from mothers who believed their children were alive, plus intake fees from new deliveries. It was a regular, predictable flow. Sensen asked where the money was coming from. Dagmar said there was a count on the island of Funen, Irina's supposed father, who sent a monthly allowance. The story was absurd on its own terms. A count, an allowance, money arriving in variable, irregular amounts. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. Never with any document to prove anything. Sensen never asked for any document. The money kept coming. He kept accepting the explanation. A woman named Anne Kirstine Christensen handed a newborn to Dagmar on the 24th of May. This time, and for reasons that never became entirely clear, Dagmar didn't kill the baby. She spent weeks caring for him. He slept in the apartment, ate, grew. At some point during the summer of 1916, a woman named Christ Hutt handed a newborn daughter to Dagmar in exchange for a monthly payment. Dagmar placed the baby in a small storage room at the back of the apartment, a kind of coal and firewood closet. No window, no ventilation. And didn't go back. The days passed. The baby probably cried for a while. Then she stopped crying. Sensen was the first to notice the smell. He started moving through the apartment, asking what it was. A strong smell, sweet in the wrong way, hard to locate, but impossible to ignore. It was summer. The heat made everything worse. Dagmar said she'd look into it. She opened the storage room. She found what she had left there. She wrapped the body in a burlap sack, climbed to the building's attic, lifted some floorboards, put it there. She came back down. Sensen asked about the smell. She said she'd found a dead rat, that she'd already thrown it out. He accepted that. This pattern, Sensen noticing something, Dagmar providing an explanation, Sensen accepting it and not asking any more, happened with a regularity that investigators would later find hard to comprehend. There was no way to prove he knew. But there was a way to notice that he chose, repeatedly, not to want to know more. A woman named Frida Sper Hansen had a newborn son she wanted to place for adoption. Frida had given birth at a maternity clinic, and both the midwife and the clinic administrator separately tried to talk her out of handing the child to Dagmar. They said something was wrong with that woman, that they had a bad feeling. The administrator said it directly, without softening it. Don't trust that woman. Frida didn't listen. She paid 100 crowns on delivery and waited for the baby's father to bring the rest. Dagmar received the child. The next day, she strangled him. She wrapped the body carefully. She placed it inside a large brown trunk. On the 2nd of September 1916, Dagmar packed her things for a trip to Aarhus, where her parents lived. At Copenhagen's train station, she was carrying her daughter, Irena, by the hand, the Christensen baby, still alive, in her arms, and the brown trunk. The train left the station on an early autumn afternoon. Irena looked out the window. The Christensen baby slept. The trunk sat in the overhead rack above their seat. That same evening, after arriving at her parents' house, Dagmar went to the back garden and buried the trunk's contents in the ground. Dagmar's parents, when they realized their daughter had arrived with a baby that wasn't hers, started pushing back. Why was she raising yet another stranger's child when she could barely support herself? Dagmar listened, thought it over, and decided to return the boy, but not to Anne Kirstine Christensen, the child's biological mother. Dagmar contacted Rasmin Jensen, the same Rasmin who had handed over Harry, discarded in the cemetery months before, the same woman who had been led to another baby's crib and left convinced she had visited her son. Dagmar said there was a family that couldn't keep the boy any longer, that she was looking for another home for him. Rasmin and her mother agreed. When the boy arrived at Rasmin's house, she didn't ask questions. He was a baby. He seemed healthy. Months later, Rasmin and her mother contacted Dagmar again. They couldn't support the boy. Finances were getting difficult. They wanted to give him back. Dagmar said she could take him back, but she would need a monthly payment of 25 crowns for his care. Rasmin agreed. The boy returned to Dagmar. Some time later, the baby got sick, bronchitis and measles, serious conditions for a small child at the time. He died in Dagmar's care, this time of natural causes. Dagmar notified Rasmin that the boy had passed away. She told her where he was buried. Rasmin went to the cemetery to visit the grave. She cried over a headstone that didn't carry her son's name. Her son had been decomposing somewhere near the Assisten cemetery for months. Olga Rosalie Hansen was another mother who had handed a newborn daughter to Dagmar in August 1916, paying 18 crowns a month for her care. Dagmar strangled the baby with a cord. Then she opened the iron door of the stove and put her inside. Olga kept coming by. She asked how her daughter was doing. Dagmar said she was fine, that she had grown, that she was a happy child. Olga paid her 18 crowns every month, punctually, for the care of a child who had turned to ash weeks before. In July 1917, a woman named Jacobsen, a friend of Anne Christensen, showed up wanting to see the boy who had been placed with Dagmar. Dagmar went to her sister Emilie's house, borrowed her son, put him in a baby carriage, and went to meet Jacobsen. "That's him," she said, pointing. "He's doing well, he's growing." Jacobsen looked at the baby. She seemed convinced. In October, she wanted to see him again. This time, Dagmar didn't have her sister's son available. So she told the truth, part of it. She said the boy had died from illness. And Jacobsen was disturbed by this and demanded a death certificate. The problem was that the certificate existed, but it had the wrong name, Jensen, not Christensen, because Dagmar had presented the Christensen baby as Rasmin Jensen's son. So the document she had in hand recorded the death of a child with the wrong surname. Dagmar went to the doctor who had issued the document. She explained there had been an error. She said the woman who had helped care for the child had, by mistake, given the wrong family name. A bureaucratic mix-up, nothing more. The doctor corrected the record without question. Jacobsen received the document. She read the name. She wasn't certain. She had no way to prove anything. She kept the certificate. The real mother, Anne Christensen, at least knew where her son's grave was, even if the name on the headstone wasn't the right one. And Sensen lived in the middle of all of it. He watched babies arrive. Sometimes he watched them leave. He never asked where they had gone. One of the detectives who entered the Vesterbro apartment that September said later that the drawer was completely ordinary. Wood darkened with use. Metal handle, the same kind anyone might have in any bedroom. Inside, wrapped in a carefully folded cloth, were 20 photographs. He went through them one by one, slowly, trying to understand what he was holding. Because the images themselves weren't immediately shocking, they were photos of babies, newborns mostly. Some sleeping, some with their eyes open, photographed face forward with the same framing, the same distance from the camera, as if someone had positioned themselves in exactly the same way 20 times. It took a moment for the logic to arrive. Dagmar didn't have a family album. There were no photos of children on the walls, no framed portraits, and none of the ordinary records that people make of children they love. These photographs were inside a drawer, wrapped up, stored away. At trial, when the prosecutor presented the photographs, Dagmar showed no surprise. She identified some of the children by name. About others, she said she didn't remember. It was the same pattern that appeared throughout the interrogation. There were deaths she described with absolute precision, and there were gaps where the memory simply no longer existed. The investigators tried to match each photograph to the documented cases. Not all of them found a match. What that means is that some of those children photographed, kept in a drawer, may not have appeared in any other record. No mother who reported anything. No death certificate. No search, just a face. Just a photograph. Just a drawer. In September 1920, Caroline Hugginson went back to the Vesterbro apartment. She had left there a few days earlier with a broken heart, but with the conviction that she had done the right thing. The woman seemed good. The apartment seemed normal. The baby would be fine. But something wouldn't let Caroline sleep. A formless unease that circled without ever becoming a complete thought. She went back. She knocked on the door. Dagmar opened it. Caroline said she had changed her mind, that she wanted her daughter back. Dagmar said she had already placed the girl with a family in a town called Egg, that she didn't know the exact address, that there was no way to contact them. Caroline left. She came back 2 days later with more questions. Dagmar repeated the same story, with the same details, without hesitating. She came back a third time, a fourth, and the fifth time, she didn't come alone. She came with 2 police officers. The detectives entered the apartment. What they felt before seeing anything was the smell, dense, sweet in the wrong way. The kind the human body recognizes before the mind processes what it is. They looked for the tiled stove. They opened the iron door. Inside the still warm ashes were small fragments, thin bones, part of a skull the size of a closed fist. In the bedroom, behind the wardrobe door, they found a small chain necklace. It was the necklace Caroline had placed around her daughter's neck before leaving. Then, in the same search, they found the drawer. With the 20 photographs inside, wrapped in the same carefully folded cloth. Dagmar was taken to the station that same afternoon. She sat in front of the investigators with a calm that the officers described in their reports as unsettling. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. She confessed. She said she had strangled the baby with a cord. She said she had soaked the small body in fuel and placed it in the stove. She said this in the same tone someone uses to describe a sequence of household tasks. Worth noting, when Dagmar was arrested, the medical reports indicated she was under the influence of volatile substances, most likely ether. Nielsen, the ex-husband she had lived with for a time, had told police he regularly caught her inhaling it. She herself had admitted she used it to calm her mind. The trial took place at the Eastern High Court of Denmark in 1921. The room was full. Outside, the press had already given Dagmar the nickname that would define her forever in the historical record: Engelmakersken, the angel maker. A bitter reference to an idea that circulated at the time, that killing poor, illegitimate children was, in a sense, an act of mercy, that it sent those souls directly to heaven, sparing them a life of suffering. Dagmar never used that argument, but others did, and the nickname stuck. In the courtroom, the mothers who had survived, the ones who had handed over children and were still alive to testify, sat in the wooden chairs with expressions that weren't grief. It was something else, harder, drier, the kind of expression that appears when mourning has already passed through the crying phase and arrived at a more silent, permanent region. Dagmar oscillated. Sometimes she sat completely still in the dock, staring at the table with an empty expression. Sometimes she seemed almost distracted. Once in a while she showed something that could be interpreted as remorse. Her shoulders dropped, her chin fell, but it never lasted. The reporters covering the case noted it daily. She had started the first day looking composed. As the sessions went on, her skin turned grey. Her hands, which she'd kept still in her lap during the early hearings, began fidgeting with her handkerchief, trembling at the edge of the dock. What her body showed and what she said never met at any point during the trial. The judge conducted the interrogation with precision. At one point, he asked about Harry, the first baby, the one from the cemetery. Yet he wanted to know why she had entered the cemetery with the child and sat down on a bench. Dagmar raised her eyes. Why does one sit on a bench? I can't answer that, but I often used to go to the cemetery with my daughter when we lived nearby. The judge didn't let it go. He asked what she had done with the baby before discarding him. Dagmar went silent. The room went silent with her. The reporters stopped writing. After a long pause, she answered in a low voice. It's so painful. It was the first genuine emotion the room had seen. The judge waited. Then he said that speaking would help her case. Dagmar swallowed. I put a cord around his neck. I think it was an umbilical cord. A woman in the gallery stifled a sob. Later, when the interrogation reached the case of Sarah, Caroline's daughter, the last victim, Dagmar described without hesitation how she had strangled the baby. Then she described, with the same objectivity, the technical difficulty of fitting the small body into the stove opening. The space was too small. She had to dismember the body to make it fit. She described this as if it were an inconvenience. When asked about her motive, about why she had done all of it, Dagmar replied, I don't know. I don't understand it myself because I love children deeply. I have thought about it a great deal, but I cannot explain it. The defense tried context. It argued that Dagmar was a product of a society that had no structure whatsoever for single mothers, for illegitimate children, for women who had nowhere to go. That she had found a real void and built something inside it. The court listened and convicted her anyway. Dagmar received the verdict without blinking. No pleas, no collapse, no visible reaction beyond a slight straightening of posture. The last woman to be executed in Denmark had died in 1862, almost 60 years earlier. The general expectation was that the king would intervene, and he did. In May 1921, the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, with no possibility of review or release. Dagmar was taken first to Christianshavn prison, then transferred to Vestre Fengsel. She was 33 years old. In 1929, Dagmar Overby died in Vestre Fengsel prison. She was 42 years old. She had served 8 years of a sentence that was meant to last forever. She died of illness, tuberculosis, according to some records, general deterioration, according to others. The prison archives record the date. They record nothing more. No relative came to claim the body. The case had changed something at least. In 1923, the Danish government enacted a specific law on the supervision of adopted children, requiring that every child born outside of marriage be placed under state protection during the adoption process, with regular oversight and formal registration. Public maternity homes were established to offer real alternatives for women in vulnerable situations. Civil registration was strengthened. The law remained in effect until 1965. The number of deaths attributed to Dagmar was never definitively established. She was convicted of 9. She confessed to 16. Police suspected at least 25. There may have been more. Some of those babies may never have been identified as victims because there was no one to register their disappearance. Children of young mothers who had handed their baby to a stranger and then left the city, or married or died, taking with them any possibility of confronting what had happened. That part will never be closed. Irina, Dagmar's daughter, doesn't appear in any records after the trial. She was 8 or 9 years old when her mother was arrested. She had waited on a sidewalk while her mother disposed of a body under a bridge. She had travelled on a train with a trunk. She had grown up in an apartment through which babies passed and disappeared. What she knew, what she understood, what she carried from all of it, that stayed in the silence that the archives don't fill. Sven Svensson, the partner who had lived at the centre of the web for years without asking questions, also disappears from the records after the trial. He was never charged, never formally held accountable. The absence of questions was not a crime in 1920. Caroline Hagensen, the last mother, the one who went to the police, the one who brought the whole thing down, appears in the case records as a witness. She received notification of the verdict. After that, she doesn't appear again. Somewhere in Copenhagen, in September 1920, she walked out of an apartment believing she had done the right thing, believing that the woman on the other side of the door was what she appeared to be. The police found the necklace inside the wardrobe, the same one she had placed around her daughter's neck before walking out the door.